In the tradition of Malcolm X, peace be unto you. In my last talk, I suggested that you read a book entitled The Jewish State by Theodore Herzl. If you want to grasp the basic fundamental design for the Jewish state called Israel, then you should read that book. Theodore Herzl, if you recall, I stated, was a member of the Zionist Congress, a primary founder of what today is the state of Israel. Now, I want to talk about another publication entitled An Essay on the Principle of Population and Other Writings, published in 1798 by Thomas Malthus. This book is purported to be the first scientific treatment on population or demographics. Our concern is with, well, what's the relevance of this book with respect to what's going on, what has been going on in the state of Israel since 1948, and how that has affected Palestinian people up to this day as they are under siege in Gaza. I think the best thing for me to do is to read 3 quotations first, analyze them a little bit, and then talk about what the end result has been for Palestinian people. So what Malthus does is lays out a plan to get rid of people, to drive people from the land, unwanted people. And of course, he is an aristocrat. He's an Englishman. And of course, he's talking about poor people in England. But it has universal applicability when colonists want to get rid of the indigenous people. So the first quote goes like this, and I quote, "Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague." That would generally be disease, end quote. So how do you encourage cleanliness? Well, you provide hospitals, you provide clean water, and you teach children basic hygiene. So if you reverse that, then you just don't provide clean water, you don't teach children basic hygiene, and you don't provide clinics to treat basic injuries that may result from infection. And so you encourage the contrary habits that a culture may have had for thousands of years. And as we know, Palestinians are Muslims and Christians and non-Christians and non-Muslims, but they do have a shared basic fundamental culture, which encourages wholesome lifestyles. Cleanliness is fundamental in Islam. And so we see that as a particular pattern over the decades, encouraged by Israel. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. The Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas in the world. You've got 2.2 or 3 million people crowded into a very small area, And so, quite naturally, you're going to have narrow streets, and that invites infectious disease. That invites diseases to spread fast. And of course, that in the long run would kill off people, or certainly make for a sickly population. And so Malthus is saying, well, if you want to get rid of people, this is something else you do. Crowd them together, make them unclean, encourage over the generations habits that are contrary to their historic traditions, that is, destroy their culture, their cultural values, and make them sick. So the last quotation I want to cite to you is, he says, but above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases. In other words, punish people who try to provide treatment or remedies for diseases that are plaguing the people, and restrain those benevolent, that would be physicians, doctors, nurses, but much mistaken men who have thought they were doing a service to mankind by projecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders. Extirpation means elimination. It could mean extermination. Here he says disorders. Generally speaking, when an empire or when colonists don't want the indigenous people around, they denigrate them by calling them animals. And that, of course, could be listed as disorders. I remember reading many 18th century and 19th century medical books on how slave masters diagnosed African slaves in the United States. And they would always cite that they had disorders, that they were naturally disordered in some way. And that, of course, set the stage for them to do harm to them, to kill them. And so you can see that Malthus provided the textbook. He provided the design. You know, if you want to get rid of people, this is how you do it. No, now, of course, they tried to do that to the indigenous people, Native Americans, by putting them on reservations and giving them blankets that were infested with smallpox. And they succeeded in killing hundreds of thousands of indigenous people. And the British did it to the indigenous people of Australia. They put smallpox in their blankets and circulated the blankets to them. And it killed thousands of them. And that, of course, happened in other places as well. Another thing is that Israel, according to an article by The Guardian, Israel used caloric counting to limit Gaza food during the blockade. And over the last 16 or 17 years, they have limited the amount of food that people living in Gaza and the West Bank could access. Now that, according to this article, instigated malnutrition amongst the population. So it gets really, really nasty when you deprive the people of the calories that they need, usually 2,500 calories a day. And you can damage children for life because you may stunt their brain development, stunt their size. And of course, that's one way to weaken people so that they don't even qualify to do things intellectually or manually, physically, when they grow to maturation. You stunt their growth by limiting the amount of food that they can access. And Israel employed that technique on the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank. And like I said, they've been doing that for decades. They certainly have been doing it in Gaza for the last 16 or 17 years. So that's very sinister. That's another sinister method that was employed to destroy, to weaken, to stunt the Palestinian people. Now, the French, the British, the United States, those are your lesson books. They are your lesson books. You can just read American history in relation to slavery and indigenous people. The Spanish did it to the indigenous people in Latin America, and we can go on and on and on. You can see how they employed Thomas Malthus's design to eliminate people that they didn't want. And of course, the Nazis in Germany learned this technique from the British, from the United States, from the Spanish. And of course, they designed it to a very scientifically oriented application, to such an extent that they were gassing people to death. But of course, they were starving them to death. You've seen the documentaries. You know what the U.S. Army and the Russian Army discovered when they found the concentration camps. So we have it going on in Gaza and the West Bank for decades, and no one has said anything. Nothing has been done. Nothing has been done from the United Nations level to stop this repression, to stop this crime against humanity. The lack of water right now worsens the misery in a besieged Gaza as Israel airstrikes continue, according to this AP release that I'm looking at. So the Israelis, just look at what they've done. They said, we're not going to allow any food. We're not going to allow any water. We're not going to allow any medicine. They've destroyed the hospitals. Children are wounded. People who need medications can't get that. Obviously, a significant percentage of them are going to die. And the Israeli defense minister said, well, all of the Palestinians are responsible for what Hamas did, beginning on, I understand, October 7th. So you're going to destroy a whole people, which is against international law. But, Israel has demonstrated it doesn't give a flying duck's quack about international law. I mean, come on, they've been breaking international law going back to when they invaded Lebanon and massacred people in refugee camps there. No one has been brought to justice at all, and they're doing it again. So what we have here, in effect, is the application of a design laid out by Thomas Malthus in his classic book. It's a classic. It's studied at all the universities to this day as a kind of intro to learning demographics. And he was quite mathematical in his description of population growth and population decline. And it's entitled, again, An Essay on the Principle of Population and Other Writings. Now, what we have here as you watch the people, 1 million plus people trying to meet the deadline to leave North Gaza to go into southern Gaza. And what are they going to do when they get there? They won't have anywhere to live. Now they want to make a massive tent city where 1 million people can live. Well, that's exactly what the United States did to the indigenous people when they put them on reservations and then forgot them. And if you recall your history, the Bureau of Indian Affairs hardly ever delivered the medicine and the food that the treaties required the government, the United States, to deliver to them on those reservations, because the reservations didn't have fertile land, and the indigenous people who were hunter-gatherer people could not hunt. So they had no protein, but they did supply them with plenty of alcohol. They supplied them with plenty of alcohol, and as a consequence, alcoholism became an entrenched cultural pattern in the indigenous population to this day. Now, cultures differ. The Islamic culture is different. The Christian culture is different. And so, but you can probably assume that there's some substance abuse that has been going on, along with the despair of the male population that cannot find employment. There's nothing for them to do. Nothing. So what we have here is another trail of tears. The Trail of Tears, of course, is a metaphor to describe the thousands of Cherokee people who were driven out of their homeland, which, by the way, the Supreme Court of that time said they had a legal right to. But President Andrew Jackson said, hey, I'm ignoring the Supreme Court decision that's in favor of the Cherokee Nation, who, by the way, were allies to the colonies when they fought the British, signed by a treaty signed by George Washington. He said, you can drag that and trash that. They wanted the land because the land was rich with minerals and farmland, and they drove the Cherokee off, and 1/3 of the Cherokee died on their way to Oklahoma. Well, look at what's happening to the Palestinian people. What do you think Israel wants? They're demolishing the whole city. And once they reach a certain stage and this gets resolved, ceasefire, they're going to call in their settlers, give them land for free, bulldoze all the buildings they've blown up, drill for oil off their coast, take all the fish, and give a quality life to the Israelis, and do everything they can to create conditions that invite death amongst the Palestinian people. That's what's going to happen unless something is done now. It's going to happen. It's already started happening. People are dying along the road, just as was the case with the Cherokee people. Now, one last point I want to make. Some of you are sitting back here in the United States, pretty comfortable. You're going to get up and go to the store, buy what you want today, or just reach in the refrigerator, get what you want. And you're not going to see the connection that any of this has to your personal or individual life. But here's what you've got to remember. These violations of international law and not bringing the violators of international law to justice sets a precedent, meaning that in this nation, the United States, within a few decades, there's going to be extreme repression again of African American people specifically, and Latinos as well. But African Americans are going to see a reversal of everything they thought they gained over the last 100 years in terms of being respected as citizens in the United States. If it can happen there and no one does anything, what makes you think it won't happen here? When circumstances change, climate change is going to corrode Americans' lifestyle, or lifestyles, plural. And inflation is going to reduce the purchasing power of the dollar. And you can see that thousands of people are being evicted from their homes, and quite a few of them are African American, and they have nowhere to go. Many of them are older women or women with children, and a lot of apartment complexes are starting to refuse. They don't want to deal with Section 8. They don't want to do the program anymore that provides housing for the poor. And rents, by the way, as you know, are skyrocketing in cost. So that's why it is relevant for you to observe closely what is happening in Palestine, as well as in other nations where you have neocolonialism, where you have empire nations stealing the minerals, the resources of people who can't resist, who cannot fight back. This is something that is relevant for you here. So if you have a comment, please leave it. If my talk has been relevant for you, give me a thumbs up. And just let me say this before I go. I'm not part of an organization. I don't do this in the name of any organization. I don't ask you for money. I don't want your money. I think you're going to need it. And I usually, 99% of the time, I forget to even ask you for a thumbs up. But at least I'll ask you for that. If you like this talk, if it is relevant, then give me a thumbs up. I am Dr. Stephen Nur Ahmed. Peace be unto you.